Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our first episode of our Southwestern Alumni Career Development Series. And for today's episode, we have Stephanie Daly. She's class of '07. Stephanie will be talking about strategies and how to prepare and navigate for job or internship interviews. But before we jump in, Stephanie, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about maybe the things you were involved on campus and what you're doing now.
Sure, absolutely. Making sure I'm not muted. Y'all can hear me? Everybody can hear me okay? Okay, good. It's like I have so many things open on my screen. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really, it's great to see people and get to talk about this and help give back to Southwestern. So I graduated from Southwestern in 2007. I studied communications and Spanish, double majored, and then I minored in psychology. And I was involved in Student Foundation. I was a Tri Delta, was in a sorority, and trying to think what else I was involved in. It's been a while now, but just loved my time there. I met my husband at Southwestern, so it's a special place for us. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. Now I am an associate professor at Texas State University. I've been there since 2014, and I teach in the Department of Communication Studies. And I also work a little bit at the UT McCombs School of Business doing communication coaching, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to go ahead and get started on the presentation. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and type it out in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So as I was preparing for this webinar, I was actually nostalgically thinking back to my time at SU, and I was remembering a story from one of my favorite professors, who is Dr. Katie Ross. She was a Spanish professor, about interviewing, and she was telling us about the academic interview process. And she recalled fielding the question, which is pretty common: where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I remember she told us that she answered how she wanted to have a home and maybe some kids and some animals, maybe a dog and a cat, maybe just a cat. And then like looking at the interviewer's face, she realized that was not what the interviewer was asking about. She was asking about, or he or she was asking about Dr. Ross's professional life. And so I was thinking about that story, and it reminded me that we all probably have lots of stories like this from maybe our own experiences or others' experiences about what not to say in an interview, what not to do in an interview. It's really easy to think about how you could bomb an interview, but I think most of the people I talk to and coach have pretty rudimentary understanding of how to actually shine in an interview, how to stand out, how to be extremely successful. And so that's really the goal of today's webinar, to learn some of these communicative strategies for success. So as I mentioned, I went to Southwestern. I didn't mention actually that after that, I went straight to graduate school at the University of Texas for my PhD in communication. And in grad school, I started applying what I was learning in the classroom, communication theory and research, as a communication coach for UT MBA students who are on the job market. And so there's this kind of contract that the McCombs School of Business has with professionals in communication to help students really succeed when they go out on the job market. And so I started working as a communication coach in graduate school, and I still do that to this day, even though my full-time job is at Texas State, where I do research and teach about the impact of communication on our work. So excited to be talking to you today about interview preparation, and look forward to hopefully helping some of you that are going to be interviewing. Maybe either you're doing it now or you're going to shortly in the future. To get started, I wanted you guys to think about your next interview. And throughout the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to share strategies for nailing that interview. So it could be anything from a student organization that you're interviewing for, all the way to maybe a promotion or an executive position, board of directors position. So there's a lot of opportunities now that require interviews. And so there's 4 main topics that I want to cover that hopefully will prepare you for that opportunity whenever it presents itself. I'm going to start by suggesting that you brainstorm behavioral interview questions and responses. So one of the first things that will likely cross your mind when you get an interview, whether it's for an internship or for a promotion is, okay, what are they going to ask, right? And you can scour the internet, you can look through Glassdoor, you can find thousands of different interview questions. One very common interview technique is called behavioral interviewing. And so these questions just ask you to tell about a time when something happened. So they could be things like, tell me about a time when you had to make a difficult decision within the last year, or what experience are you most proud of? Or describe a role where you changed the direction of a team. So all these questions invite stories from your past experiences. And as you can imagine, they're challenging to prepare for and anticipate. And I've seen a lot of interviewees, a lot of clients that I coach wasting lots of hours crafting calculated responses to every single possible behavioral interview question they might field. Notice there I said waste time, right? So what do I think you should do to brainstorm about these questions? I suggest that there's 4 basic behavioral question types. So there's strength questions. These are questions that are very positively framed. These are usually the easiest questions because they're all happy, right? So tell me about a time you succeeded. What are you most proud of? Share an experience where you completed a project under budget or before a deadline, right? All positive things that you did well in your past. Then there's the opposite of that, which are usually the questions we fear the most. Tell me about, these are weakness questions, weakness-based questions. So tell me about a time you failed. What's something you would do over in your career or in your school experience? Another example might be to explain an instance where you didn't have enough time or resources to complete an assignment or task. That's the second category. The third category are interpersonal based questions. So these are questions about leadership and teamwork, questions that involve you engaging your interaction with others. So things like, tell me about a time you led a team, what kind of group member are you, or explain a conflict you had with a coworker. And then lastly, analytical questions. These are questions that ask about your ability to problem solve or use data. So questions like, tell me about a time you solved a problem, and perhaps a question that is framed as, explain how you use data to find the best solution to a problem, or something like, describe a role in which you had to analyze data. So my theory is that almost all behavioral questions can fall into these 4 buckets. So the question might be phrased a little bit more specifically, like it might ask about a strength within a certain context, or a weakness that you had in the past, but you don't have anymore, right? It might be phrased slightly different, but in general, I find that when I'm prepping people for interviews, almost all the questions we practice can be bucketed in these 4 different categories. And once you understand those categories, then you can brainstorm and anticipate answers or types of questions and how you're going to answer them. So I suggest making a spreadsheet like this. You can, if you're a computer person, like I do everything electronically, I don't even have paper. Like if I were to look for a piece of paper right now, it'd be hard for me to find one. So I would do this electronically. But if you're old school and you like note cards, or if you're tactical and you want sticky notes or something, you could do this however you want. But I suggest making some kind of grid with 4 columns for each question type. And then to prepare for an interview, you want to think about 3 or 4 rows deep of examples of stories that you could use to answer that type of question. Some of your stories might overlap. So for example, your success story might be when you solved a problem, or the time you failed might have been when you were working in a team because someone sucked, So you can copy some cells, you can use some examples again or over again, and you're just highlighting different features of that story. But in general, when you're prepping for an interview, you want to have about 10 to 12 really well thought out stories. So you might be thinking, great, Stephanie, I will do that. But what the heck am I supposed to put in those little cells? What am I supposed to say in those stories? So that's what I want to talk about next, is using stories in your interview responses that can convey your skills and experiences in a compelling way. So we know that stories are really powerful because they help candidates sound more interesting, more believable, more memorable. And you can think of stories as just like little anecdotes or examples, and they give interviewers a really deep but condensed picture of who you are. So it's a really good bang for your buck, right? If you're thinking, I'm going to sit down for this interview, it's going to be 30 minutes to an hour, there's only so much word count I have, almost only so much I can say. You really want to make every word count. And so using stories can be a powerful way to do that. Sometimes people ask how long a story should be. Like, what do you mean when you say story? I think a lot of times we think of an actual book or like a bedtime story I read my kids. These responses should be about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So you're going in enough depth to give the person a sense of what things were like and how you reacted in that scenario. But you don't want to drag on so that it gets boring or you lose interest or comprehension. So I did give some examples about like, tell me a time when. I did want to note though that not all questions that are behavioral might be phrased like that, like tell me about a time or tell me about an experience. But I always suggest giving a story, even if the question is something like, what kind of leader are you? Right? That sounds like a very philosophical question that might just have a short answer, like I'm a very collaborative leader, or I lead by example. But I suggest that even in those types of questions, you still tell a story because we know that stories help people sound more persuasive. It really helps people walk that line between sounding cocky but sounding believable, right? So it's like you want to show your experience and say that you're good at something. And a lot of times the way to do that is by showing rather than just saying. And so if you can show through a story, you're gonna achieve all these great results that you want, like sounding interesting, persuasive, and memorable. So when you think about telling a story, there's an easy way to kind of prepare these examples and prepare these anecdotes. And that's by just using a very simple format. So you can use this STAR or Stair format. Some people omit the E. So I'll walk through each of these and just kind of explain what this acronym means. But in a nutshell, if you look at this as a whole, if you're like, oh, that looks really detailed and I'm not a very detailed person, I'm a more big picture person. Basically, this boils down to setting up a problem and then talking about the solution. So all narrative has that basic problem solution format. We don't care about an anecdote really if it doesn't have a tension or if it doesn't have a hook or something exciting about it. So even if the behavioral question is something positively framed, like a strengths question, you still want to set up that problem because that makes your impact or your success more powerful, right? So you always want to address it with this kind of problem solution framework, or in more detail, STAR or STAIR. So the first step in the format is the S, which is situation. That's just setting up kind of the story by explaining the circumstance or the context in which you were in. So you might say something like, I was a volunteer coordinator at an animal shelter, and my role involved staffing 25 weekly volunteer spots, right? You're just like kind of explaining the role you were in, whether that was a student organization role or a past job, a volunteer commitment, something like that. The second step, the T, is to present the tension, the problem, the issue. This is the drama in the story. So you might say something like, every year around the holiday season, volunteers were constantly canceling. And one week it was so bad, the animal shelter actually had to close entirely because we didn't have anyone to feed and walk the animals, right? So immediately you're like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to the animals, right? You're drawn in. You have to have that tension in order to really get people on board with wanting to know the rest of the story. And so then you reach that kind of climax, or I forgot what it's called in that story form, but you explain the action. So what you did to resolve that tension. And so in this case, in my volunteer example, you might say that you created a volunteer backup plan where you coordinated among all the volunteers some kind of system so that when a volunteer couldn't show up, they had the ability to log in and find a replacement. And then the most important part is the result or impact of what you did. And this is the part that a lot of people forget about. So here you want to show how your work, how your action solved that problem that you set up earlier. So for instance, in this example, you could talk about how because of the volunteer backup plan that you put in place, the shelter never had to close. And you actually saw an increase in volunteers by 30% because volunteer spots were better managed and people actually created a community around volunteering. You're like, wow, that's awesome, right? So if you show that result, it really makes your experience pop. There's one last step that some people add, which is the E, and that stands for effect. This is really helpful if you're pivoting careers or if you're interviewing for a position that you have little experience. So maybe it's like an internship or your first full-time job. It's nice to add the E. And this is where you connect the experience back to the position for which you're interviewing. So you might say something like, in this volunteer example, that volunteering and this story, this experience of solving a problem really showed me that if you think creatively about an issue, then you can really change things for the better. And so if I have the opportunity to work here as an intern, I hope to be able to use my creativity to make an impact on your team here at this company, right? So you're connecting what you did in the past to how it's going to help that in that role in the future. So I gave you a little bit of examples as I was going through each letter, but let me give you a full concrete example from a past client that I coached. So this is the scenario, or the question we were prepping for was about a time that you faced a conflict or disagreement. And this particular person had passed in finance, and they were going to be interviewing for consulting, so a career changer. So the situation that they set up, I'm just going to read this. This person said, during my stint at WeWork as a member of the financial planning and analysis team, I was working on an assignment that involved identifying cost savings in the business. As you might know, WeWork is a company that's very passionate about how it projects its culture, caters to the gig economy, startups, and large enterprises. And a permanent fixture in every pantry area is the presence of a fruit water dispenser. It became apparent that this might be an opportunity to save on significant costs. That's the setup, right? That's what's going on. Now we enter the problem. The problem became apparent, note that cue, as there was a conflict. That's what the question's about. Between the cost of the water cooler and the containment of WeWork's culture. A fruit water dispenser, which is just a fancy machine with fruit, ice, and water, is a costly endeavor. In addition to training staff on how to operate the machine, it was taking a person about 2 hours a day to refill and take care of the water dispenser. That adds up to 10 hours per week or 40 hours per month. Not to mention you don't even eat the fruit, so we're buying and literally throwing away expensive kiwis and apples for the water. But this cost savings opportunity came into conflict with WeWork's culture. There was strong opposition from employees to keep the dispenser because many believed it was a defining aspect of WeWork's culture. Fruit water is synonymous with WeWork. The move was unpopular across the board, right? So you're like, what's going to happen? This is a big conflict, right? And then the action, remember, is this person's work, like what they did to solve the problem. So they could say, I presented the cost savings initiative to management, received buy-in from all stakeholders, and then in a town hall to address the disgruntled employees, I explained how the funds could be better allocated to enhance employee and customer experiences. In the end, I identified $105,000 in savings and managed to appease unhappy employees by using some of our saved funds for gifts and prizes. And so now this person, as I mentioned, who is a career changer, is going to connect it back to the experience of consulting. So they say, this was my first experience where I had to face disagreement and defend my decision at a town hall meeting. Remember, that's what the question is about. It was a learning experience. In my future as a consultant, I know I'll have to defend my analysis and recommendations. So even if they don't sound like music to clients' ears, this experience taught me how to manage expectations and deliver impact, even amidst conflict. So see how that takes this person's experience and really shows that even though it was in a very different context in calculating the cost savings of this endeavor, that they could use that same skill in consulting. So that's kind of how that format works. And you can see how the words conflict and disagreement are repeated in the response because that's what the question was about. But this story could also be adapted, maybe about like, tell me about a time you solved a problem. And in that case, I would just suggest that this person replace a few of those words about conflict or disagreement with words like problem solving words. And so you can use a really good story like this for a different answer if you see fit. So in addition to these behavioral questions, which again comprise a lot of the questions you're going to be fielding in an interview, I also wanted to address some of the big questions that you might want to address strategically in an interview. So let's talk next about how you should prepare and respond to those. So before you get asked to talk about a time when you faced conflict on a team or had to solve a problem, you'll likely be handed a few of these questions, which I call big questions. And so big interview questions, the very first question most people ask is something like, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. That's a big question. Another big question are ones like, why should we hire you? Or why are you interested in this company or role? When I work with one-on-one with clients to help them with their answers to these big questions, which you do want to answer strategically, um, I suggest reverse engineering your response. So, what do I mean by reverse engineering? Most people tend to approach these big questions in a really straightforward way. So, like when asked to walk through your resume, for example, people go through each role and mention their job responsibilities. When people are asked about their interest in the company, people explain just what they like about the organization, which is very genuine, right? Those are very genuine responses. And there's nothing wrong with being genuine, but you want to remember that an interview is a competition. And so you don't just want to show who you are, you need to convey why you're the best person that there is for this role. So I encourage you to craft your answers just strategically by kind of reverse engineering, or what I say, which is to focus more on what the interviewer is seeking and then highlight those attributes and qualities that you have that match with what the interviewer is, what the role is asking for. So, to give an example of this, there are a lot of hats that I wear in life, right? So, I already talked about myself as a teacher, as a researcher, as a communication coach. I'm also a wife, I'm a mom. I like to cook, I like to eat, I like to decorate, I like to exercise. I have a lot of things going on, right? We all have a lot of parts of ourselves, whether that be professional or personal. And depending on who I'm talking to or the opportunity I'm seeking, I could choose to highlight different aspects of my skills and interests very selectively. So for this audience, I've just chosen to underscore my experience as a professor and a coach. But if I were talking to someone that maybe was, I don't know, they wanted to create a new cookbook, I'd be like, that'd be so cool. Like I would talk about my experience in cooking and eating. I wouldn't talk about my role as a researcher necessarily. So remember that at the end of the day, the goal of the interview is to show that you fit. You fit the role, you fit the company, you fit the culture. And so by focusing on the qualifications that you have that fit the role, rather than trying to just like cram everything into your response, that's a more strategic way to kind of answer the question and reverse engineer your response. So this means, for example, when you're responding to the question, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, you might not just describe your job duties in detail. Like you might not go through, well, in my role, I have basically 3 duties. I do X, Y, and Z. Or a lot of people talk about a project that's consumed most of their time. That's a common response to a walk me through your resume. I've had these jobs in the past, the main one in this, the main one in that. Instead, I suggest thinking, again, reverse engineer, think about what that role is requiring. And it's not a surprise. You look at the job description, right? Are they asking for someone that's customer centric? Are they asking for someone that can manage data? Are they asking for someone that has communication skills, right? So think about 1 or 2 activities that you've had in your past roles that really showcase the knowledge, skills, abilities that the interviewer is seeking. And then you can phrase your experience as something like, so let's say you're a first time full-time job seeker for the first time. So you've had just student organization and internship experience. So you might say something like, and let's say in your internship, you didn't do many things related to what the job you're applying for, right? So let's say that you, oh goodness, I'm like blanking on examples right now, but let's just say it wasn't as related as would have liked it to be. Then you don't have to go through all of your job duties that were not related. You can focus on the one thing that was related. So if you can you should be able to pull out at least one skill or one experience from that internship that is related to the job that you're seeking. And you can say something like, one thing I really enjoyed in this role, or one thing I'd really like to highlight about that experience is that it afforded me the opportunity to blank, learn more about marketing, which is what you're interviewing for, or it taught me really how to dive deep into data, which is a skill that they're looking for. So instead of thinking about all the experience you had in each role and walking through that in your resume, just think about 1 or 2 really salient experiences that you can highlight that align with what the job opportunity or position is that you're seeking. And so if you do that for the past roles that you've had, whether those be professional experiences or volunteer experiences, then at the end of your walk me through your resume or tell me about yourself, you have the ability to transition to something like a good summary statement, which I always suggest ending on. So something like, in sum, I've spent the last few years really honing my ability to X, Y, and Z. What 3 skills are they looking for? Collaborate on teams, understand how different business units work, or manage multiple responsibilities. And I'm excited about this opportunity so that I can flex those skills in a new environment here at Whole Foods, whatever. So you're using that way. You can really pivot to, these are the skills that I have that are relevant, that you care about, and now I want to use those skills for this opportunity, versus just rehashing your resume for things that might not or may be related, and then the interviewer has to pull out, ooh, okay, yes, check, no, check, right? You're doing that work for them by reverse engineering. Does that make sense? And then the second thing that I suggest doing is to convey capability, not just interest. So in some of those why questions, like why should we hire you, why this company, why this role, you really want to, again, confirm your fit. And so if you think about it, everyone can have a passion or interest in something, but not every candidate is going to be able to speak to the ways in which they can actually fill those needs or be good at that role. So when you're asked about these kind of big questions, I suggest thinking about the top 3 reasons why you're interested or like the role, but then go one step beyond that and give an example for each one so that you can talk about why you have that thing or why you would be a good fit. So, so if you ask, for example, I'll use a silly example. If you asked, like, why, Stephanie, should I let you make my dinner tonight? I told you guys I have a passion for cooking, right? So if I'm very genuine, I might just say, because I love cooking. And that would be conveying my interest, right? But if I wanted to also convey my capability, I might say something like, I, believe it or not, I won a cooking competition. Isn't that a fun fact, right? And then that piques your interest, like, oh, okay, not only is she interested in cooking and she likes cooking, but she's actually probably pretty good at it if she's won a competition. And that's going to persuade you to want me to make your dinner more than just my mere passion for cooking. So you might think about how you could do the same in an interview context, in a professional context. If you think about, a genuine reason that you might want to work, let's say Apple. I feel like a lot of people always use Apple as like, that's my dream job at Apple. And a genuine reason you might want to work at Apple is because you love innovation. So your response might sound something like this. There are several reasons I'd love to work at Apple. I always suggest giving multiple reasons, not just one. So at least 2 or 3 reasons. So there's several reasons I'd like to work at Apple. First, I'm really passionate about innovation, which is a cornerstone of this company. I found that personally, when I can think outside of the box and come up with creative solutions, like I did for my team and the robotics competition last year, I really thrive. And so I know I'll be successful at Apple first and foremost because of my drive to just create new things and have new ideas and products. Second reason is right? So see what I did there? I showed that not only am I know nothing about robotics or innovation, but that was just an example, that I am not only interested in innovation and interested in new product design and new ideas, but that I'm actually good at it by dropping the little example of the robotics competition. So it doesn't have to be a drawn out story in these why questions and these big questions, but you want to give some tangible experiences or anecdotes or examples so that you're not just saying, I'm good at this, but you're really showing that you're good at it. And you're not just saying, I like this, but you're showing that you're good at that thing. Does that make sense? Hopefully so. So those are some ways that you can kind of reverse engineer your response to those really big questions. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was, at the end of the interview, what often happens at the conclusion is the interviewer will ask, what questions do you have for us? And this is a question I get from clients a lot too, like, what are good questions to ask? So I have 2 suggestions. One is to show that you did your homework, that so you would ask questions about the role, about the company, and about the industry as a whole, showing that you've done some research about the company, the role, and the industry as a whole. So you can frame the question with this kind of, fill in the blank. So I read that, blah, 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 blah. How is your company, blah, 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 blah. So you show that you've either read something or heard something, or in class I've learned, or, in class we're learning about this. That's a great way for students to express their knowledge in a subject when they maybe haven't had experience. or I've talked to people in the industry that are saying yada, yada, yada. You want to show that you know what's happening in that space. And then that's an opportunity to ask a question about it. So you can ask, like, how is this company dealing with it? How will this role address that problem? Or how is your company facing this change? So as an example, you might say something like, I read that a growing amount of corporate marketing budgets, almost 10% now, are being spent on social media stories. And I'm curious how your team's strategy has changed with this shift to really temporary content, right? So you're showing that you've read or that you know what's happening in social media, and then you're asking how that team is dealing with it. Or I thought of a law school example, perhaps, or those that might be interviewing for graduate schools. You might say something like, I've heard from first-year law students that there are opportunities to apply what we learn outside of the classroom. Can you tell me more about your school's perspective on experiential learning? So instead of just asking a question that really might be a genuine question, but just asking the question outright, if you can show that that question is grounded in something, then that's a really powerful way to just take your question to the next level and really show that you're a smart cookie and that you think and keep up to date with things in the world and in the industry that you're going to be working in. So I think that's a really good way to shine when asking good questions. The second strategy is a little sneaky. So this is to ask questions about things you want to talk more about. So this might be an instance where, you've prepped all these really awesome stories, you've done the grid, you've done your homework, and shoot, you didn't get to mention like your biggest asset, right? Or you didn't get to tell the story about teamwork that you really wanted to talk about. Well, you can ask a question that is going to bring up that information or elicit that information so that it gives you a chance to talk about how you fit the company. So let's say, for example, and this could also be something that you are genuinely interested in, but that you want to talk more about as well. But let's say, for example, that you have a passion for diversity and inclusion, and you've been involved in organizations with that focus, but it just hasn't come up in the interview. So you could ask something like, I read that diversity is one of your company's values. Again, that shows you did your homework. What diversity and inclusion efforts are taking place, or how do you see managers fostering diversity and inclusion? And then the interviewer will answer, we do this, we do this, we do that. And then that gives you the chance to say, oh, I'm so happy to do that because diversity and inclusion is actually a passion of mine. In fact, last year I was involved in da, 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 right? So you get to talk about that thing that you want to talk about. And so that can be a good opportunity to ask questions about that. And then lastly, I didn't write this on the slide, but it's always a good idea just to end the interview by indicating your continued interest in the position, by asking like what steps are next in the interview process. That's always a good final question, just to, again, give you some insight into like what's going to happen next, how long am I going to have to wait, but also just show that you're interested in the position as well. So speaking of next steps, I think it's about time for the Q&A of our webinar. So I'm excited to hear your comments and answer your questions. I've also put my contact information here for those of you that are interested in one-on-one coaching, or if you have like specific interviews that you want to practice for. I do a lot of mock interviews with folks and also help people craft their interview responses as they're preparing for interviews too. So yes, I'm excited to hear from you guys and hopefully help out. Anybody want to start? You can unmute or you can ask in the chat. Either way is fine with me. One question I am getting a lot now. I did brainstorm one thing that really didn't fit into my content, but that I am getting a lot of questions about now is interviews over Zoom. So I know, like, for example, a lot of grad schools and law schools are doing, and even actually I have a couple of clients that have done this for investment banking. So like totally different industry, that are doing pre-recorded interviews. So you have a certain amount of time to record your interview. You get like 3 tries and you have to submit that. Or obviously because of COVID, a lot of interviews have been taking place over Zoom. So I've gotten a lot of questions about how to handle Zoom, how to answer questions over Zoom. And I think all of the content I shared does apply to the virtual setting. But there are some differences and nuances that I'm happy to talk about too, if that's something. Diana, do you think that's something people might want to hear about?
Yes, definitely. I
Okay,
was
okay,
gonna add something regarding
okay,
that.
okay, great. So I there's I think the first thing to be really attuned to is just that Zoom and like a virtual environment really takes a lot more work to build rapport in a mediated environment. So whereas in a face-to-face interview, you're going to have the time in the lobby waiting for the interview, and then you're going to walk down the hall perhaps to the office, and you get a lot of chit chat time, right? You get a lot of like, hey, how's it going? What are you like? And the interviewer can really get a feel for what your personality is like, and things like that. It's really awkward to do that on Zoom. I think that's just something you have to acknowledge and be aware of, that it's just going to take more work, but that it is just as important. So I really suggest um, people thinking in advance about some ways that you can establish rapport online, or in a mediated environment. So really thinking about like questions that you can, just informal questions you can ask before the call. Like if it's a Friday or even if it's a Thursday, I always ask people like, oh, we made it to the end of the week. What do you have going on? Right. That's what kind of Diana and I were chatting about. Or like she asked me about my vacation when we got on the call because she had known that I was on vacation. Um, you can use context clues. So look behind the person and ask like, oh, it looks like you're an Astros fan. Like, are you watching the World Series? Right. Um, so that's one strategy, is to use like either current events that are happening or times of the week that are happening to ask questions, or to use context clues to ask questions. Um, but just knowing that building rapport is also really important on Zoom. It's also important to just think about in advance where you're going to be Zooming and set up, your stage to kind of use that metaphor. I always suggest having really good lighting because that makes the camera like literally work better. So you'll come across as sharper. You want to always like raise your laptop or your screen so that you're eye level with the camera versus if my computer was down here. Oh, there goes my water, right? That doesn't look as lovely. Not that I look lovely like this, but it just looks better and more like you're actually in a conversation versus you're on Zoom. It just makes it feel a little bit more real. You also always want to look towards the top half of your screen and not down. So if you do have like notes or something that you're looking at, definitely make sure they're not on the table. That's a long way for your head to travel. And if they are on the screen, I would try to move them as close to the top of the screen as possible. And then that brings me to the third and final question that I get is like, can you use notes if it's on Zoom or even a phone call? Like, should I use notes? I always discourage people from like reading because you have to really practice reading well to not sound like you're reading. But I think it's fine to have some notes jotted down. I always suggest underlining the key words in a sentence and trying to just speak off those underlined words. That's one way to try to speak more extemporaneously. So like, for example, if my sentence is, I'm here today and I'm excited to be talking to you, you would just underline here today talking, right? And you could recreate that sentence like, oh, it's great to be here today. I'm glad I could talk to you. So it sounds more natural. And then what was I going to say about the notes? Anything else? Yeah, I mentioned having them up. And I think those are my main tips for Zoom. I did see Lupe and Julia ask questions, so let me read those now. Lupe says, for medical school interviews, I know a lot of them have very similar values. How can I make sure I ask questions more specific to their individual school? Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say in the stem of the question, you could talk about like how you learned that value, or even how you've like seen that value play out for that particular school. Like, in my coffee chat with a first year student here or with a resident, like it really seemed like you guys value safety, and I'd love to hear more about that. So I think just pointing out how you've seen that thing or how you learned about that value can be valuable and make it a little bit different. In a similar vein, when you're asking questions that might sound a little trite, like, or just things that people always get asked, like in a job, for example, what's the culture like here? Like everybody asks that question, right? But it is a genuine question. Like you really do want to know what the culture is like, and probably the same in medical school. You really want to know what they care about, where they're focusing their time and attention. Sometimes, if in the stem of the question, if you present a personal reason for asking that question, it can make it sound more genuine. So, for example, if I'm asking about the culture, instead of just saying, what's the culture like here? What's been your experience with the culture? I could say something like, um, you know, I was really fortunate in my first job or in my internship that the company I worked at had an amazing culture. And I just saw how that culture really shaped my performance and made me so much more motivated and just really helped our team perform better. So I'm curious what the culture is like here, right? So first, that was great because you kind of tooted your own horn and showed that you can really perform and be motivated and things like that. But it also kind of almost gives an excuse to ask that question versus it just sounding like a question that everybody else asks. So that might be a similar technique you could use with the values, is something like, one reason that really attracts me to be a physician, or to work in the medical field is my passion for helping others, and I just really want to make a difference in people's lives, and might sound cheesy, but help the world be a better place. And I happen to notice that was something that was on your website too. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Right, so that it kind of connects the dots of why you're asking that question. That might be a technique to use. Does that help? I'm going to just guess that you're nodding and smiling because that's what would make me happy. Okay, good. You're welcome. Okay, so Julia said, thank you so much for this presentation. You're very welcome. Do you have any tips for showing how my skills are transferable to a new industry? I've been interviewing for months now and have been finding this aspect challenging. Yeah. So I think that when you're transitioning into a new industry, it can sometimes be challenging for people to see those dots connecting, even though to you it's very resonant. So I think I would encourage you, if you're not doing this already, just to really spell it out for those folks. So say something like, so as an example, and I don't know your circumstance exactly, but I work with quite a few veterans who have been using skills that are being asked for in certain industries, but they're in a very different context, very different industry, right? So, for example, like a someone in the military might be responsible for leading a team of people, but it's in a very different context, right? It's like literally in battle or in the field, not like leading a team of direct reports virtually on Zoom, right? So making that connection, and because the context is so different, sometimes that doesn't come off as transferable as it really is. And so I think just really being explicit about that and saying something like, I did lead teams in the past, or I have executed this skill in this context, which I recognize is a different industry, but I still have that skill, just to try to communicate that. I think that can be really a helpful way to do it. And just making sure too, in your initial kind of walk me through your resume and your pitch, or kind of however you're introducing yourself, that you're sometimes it's more helpful to start with the transferable skills than it is your past. So for example, I worked recently with someone who is an architect, and they were transitioning into consulting. And so instead of starting by like, I've been working as an architect for the last few years, and now I'm really interested in going into consulting as an architect. I, helped people create their dream houses and led cross-functional teams to execute the projects I was doing, right? So instead of like talking about your past a lot in the beginning, or like just focusing on your past, it's helpful sometimes to pull out those skills and then talk about how the skills resonate. So that person could say instead, like, I'm really interested. Thanks for meeting with me. I'm really interested in this opportunity about consulting because I love helping people solve problems, and I love working with clients to deliver results. In the past, I did that in the context of architecture. I worked with clients to understand their needs, and then we would build their dream homes, and their dreams would become reality. So then you're like priming the audience to see your skills as related. So if you like start with the end result of like, this is why I'm interested in this industry, and these are the skills that it uses that I have, and then talk about your past. Sometimes I found with that person, it really helped. So that might be something to think about, is like start again, kind of that reverse engineer tactic, start with what you have, the skills that you have, and then connect that to why you're interested. Hopefully that helps. Um, let's see. Okay, great. A Bond said, is there a way to assess work-life balance at a company in the interview process, or is it better not to address? Ooh, that's such a good question. Some companies are kind of known for their work-life balance or lack thereof. And so I think if you're in one of those industries, or if it's a company that you know is a certain way, it's okay to address that. Or if you've heard from a lot of different people that it's that way, then that's a bridge you could cross. Like, for example, I know some people struggle with bringing up like their family commitments in an interview, or they want to be genuine about like that they want to have kids or that they do have kids. And I really only suggest bringing that up if you know that that's a very strong culture and environment. Like at some companies, that is a big part. Like they really do want kids running around or something like that. So then it would be okay to breach that. And then I would justify, like, I've talked to a lot of people and they said this is really part of the culture. So I'm excited because I really want a family too. But if it's not, then you definitely want to just leave that for later. I would say, so let's say your question is that you have no idea, right? You just don't know about this company and what their perspective is on work-life balance. And sorry, now I'm rereading your question. Is there a way to assess, not address? My bad. So assessing, I think, ooh, that's a really good question. I think you can ask questions like, what are the norms? How many, like, what are the norms for, I don't know, that's challenging because you don't want to come across as like, you're just asking because you don't want to work a lot, right? Like, what are the norm? How many hours a week do you typically work or something like that? Man, I'm sorry, I'm struggling with this question. I think I would try to find more informal ways to assess that. So instead of asking directly, maybe try to observe a lot of the interview. If you have the opportunity to visit or like walk around and look and see, okay, how many people are eating lunch at their desks versus going somewhere for lunch, or if it's at the end of the day, how many people are still here. Yeah, that's a good question. I will keep thinking, but I don't think I have a good answer except for just kind of trying to informally assess that. Or you could assess it by asking about the culture in general. And if they do bring it up, then that's a good indicator that they do have a work-life balance. But if not, if they don't bring it up, then that might be that it's a challenge. I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon because I feel like the last year and a half or however long we've been in COVID has really brought to light some of those challenges and everybody's dealing with them. So hopefully it will become more the norm to talk about those things. But I think in the past hasn't been such a norm to talk as much about work-life balance in an interview. Yeah. Okay. I'm glad you got something out of that ramble. Good question. Okay, Julia, this might be slightly unrelated to the interview itself, but what do you think about companies asking applicants to do home exercises during the interview process? So Julia, are you talking about like homework essentially, or like giving someone a problem to solve and then asking them to do that work and showcase their, almost like a case study kind of? Gonna wait for your response there to make sure I understood what you mean by home exercises. Completely, yeah, exactly. So yeah, that is common, or I think becoming more common, is really a way to see if the rubber can meet the road. Like if you can do those things that you say you can do. And so I guess your question is, what do I think about them? I think they are a valid way to assess performance. I've heard of companies actually where I did my dissertation research. The company did that in a group setting, so they literally watched applicants solve a problem as a group and like watch team dynamics unfold and that kind of thing. So I think it can be a powerful way to see how people are going to work in a genuine way. It does take a lot of work and effort because you're like, it's a full-time job applying for a job. And then when you're having to do work on top of that, these like homework assignments, that's even more work. So it is unfortunate, but I think that it's something that I could see an employer justifying that action. I think from the interviewer's perspective, if you want to know how to succeed in that, I think it's a good idea to make sure you really understand the assignment as best as possible. So if you have questions, I wouldn't hesitate asking questions. I mean, the worst they can say is like, nope, this is all the information we're giving, right? So if they say like, let's say it's Coke and they're like, we want to, create a new product. So come up with a pitch for us. That's your homework assignment. And you're like, well, does the pitch, you could ask follow-up questions like, how long would you like the pitch to be? What's my target audience? What other information can you give me? Right. And they might just say, nope, that's it. That's the assignment. Or you might be able to get more information. So I'd say like the more information you can get, the better. And then I'm trying to think of other strategies for really how to shine in that assignment. But I think, yeah, getting the most information you can be powerful, and then following up as much as you can on that too. So like, what feedback did you have for me on that? Or what do you think how could I improve on this? Because that shows that you're going to be a good person to develop as an employee, maybe. Yeah, you're welcome. Other questions? I appreciate your guys' questions, and please feel free to share. I know Dinah's recording, so feel free to share this with folks that you think might be interested or benefit from this. And I'm happy to follow up with anyone who ever needs help as well or has additional questions.
Yep. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for your presentation. I hope everybody got a lot out of this because I sure did. Stay tuned in for our next episode. That will be going out soon. And I hope you all enjoy your Friday and your weekend. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.